Our top story takes us to Germany, where world leaders have endorsed a UN arms embargo on Libya at a summit in Berlin. The different sides agreed to end the role of foreign powers in the country's war as part of a wider plan to end the conflict. This report has the details.
With over 100,000 people killed and over 1 million displaced, the world has finally turned its attention to the conflict in Libya. Rival camps in the to end the long-running war. Gathered together by Germany, the presidents of Russia, Turkey and France, among others, signed a plan to stop interference in Tripoli's affairs.
We have to make sure that all the parties involved in the Libya conflict speak with one voice. And that was the goal of today's conference. Because then also the parties inside Libya will understand that there is only one non-military way to a solution. And we have achieved this goal.
Libya's UN-recognized Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj and the commander of the Eastern Forces, Khalifa Haftar, also appeared at the gathering. However, they refused to meet each other but did agree to set up a military commission, a step towards a lasting ceasefire. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stressed a widespread support for the ceasefire.
We need to have a ceasefire. We have a truce. And one central question is that all the participants today committed to support the ceasefire and committed to put pressure on the parties to the conflict for a full ceasefire to be reached.
Speaking at the conference, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he hoped Libya's major oil fields will now be reopened. Khalifa Haftar's military closed eastern Libya's oil ports before the Berlin summit.
Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're now joined by Joel Shalit, who is a journalist based in Berlin. Joel, as always, we appreciate your time here at Indus News. Now, the summit in Berlin, Joel, for Libya has endorsed the UN arms embargo on that country. How important is that, do you think, for peace?
It's a nice gesture, but I don't think it's going to have any practical consequence given the diverse number of suppliers that help fuel the conflict. Also, one must remember that the Libyan civil war, which is now nearly a decade old, has been heavily fueled by domestic arms supplies that were accrued during the Gaddafi period. Libya has had one of the richest stockpiles of military weapons in North Africa and in the greater Middle East. It's not unlike Syria in that regard. So it's a cosmetic gesture. It's more than anything else. And the main problem is going to be finding a way to halt the third parties involved in the conflict outside of Haftar and Sarraj's forces acquiring weapons on their own, regionally. One must remember that nearly a third of the country is still controlled by various militias under neither faction's control.
Indeed. So let's talk external players if we can, because they've agreed to end their respective roles in Libya's war as part of a wider plan to end the conflict there. What are the chances of them actually keeping to that agreement that they've just signed?
The two primary foreign players in the conflict are Turkey and Russia. And Turkey already has troops on the ground. They've brought both their own troops and elements of their own, Syrian Foreign Legion to help defend the incumbent UN-recognized government. We didn't hear anything about Turkey withdrawing those forces as part of those agreements, and we should keep our eyes out for any announcements of Turkey withdrawing those troops. Similarly, the Russians have a history of putting down mercenaries such as the Wagner Group in trouble spots like Syria and not taking responsibility for them, saying they're private contractors when in fact they are an arm of the Russian military and they are executing Russian foreign policy. So jury is still out as far as Turkey and Russia are concerned. I think it's very important, again, vis-a-vis Syria, that we look at many of the same dynamics being at play in Libya as we do in Syria, with many of these same actors behaving exactly the same way. I mean, the reasons why the Russians and the Turks are so heavily involved in Libya is because there is an international power vacuum in North Africa. The Americans have ceased to play an active role, though they still have troops in the region. And the same goes for the European Union. And so they're filling a gap, and they're also positioning themselves to have access to the oil supplies that are still so important to the country's present and future economy. The Turks recently secured an agreement from the Sarraj government to have access to coastal natural gas assets, which has put the Turks in direct confrontation with both Greece, Israel, Egypt. It's a mess, and these larger issues need to be disentangled as well, not just the fact that they have forces active on the ground.
We just have a minute left, Joel. The Prime Minister Faisal Sarraj and Khalifa Haftar refused to meet each other. To what extent does that then create an obstacle?
You know, I don't think that there's going to be any national reconciliation between the two parties. I think that simply reflects the fact that Libya is divided largely between two warring factions, one of which has more territory than the other. Haftar and his troops occupy 2/3 of the country and by default run the country. I have a hard time understanding why the European Union and the West is so focused on guaranteeing the continuity of the Sarraj government.
Very well, Joel. We'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate your analysis. That was Joel Shalit speaking to us there from Berlin. Let's move on now to Hong Kong, where police have arrested a prominent pro-democracy activist a day after protests there turned violent. Yesterday, violence broke out after thousands of demonstrators attempted to march through the city in defiance of a ban. In a statement, the Hong Kong Civil Assembly team said Ventus Lau was arrested on charges of obstruction of police administration. Earlier, authorities allowed protesters to demonstrate as long as participants stayed in one location. But the protests moved in defiance of prior warnings, prompting riot police to fire tear gas and arrest several people. The protest began in June last year against a bill allowing extradition to mainland China. The bill was withdrawn 3 months later, but demonstrations continue and now demand complete democracy. In Lebanon, meanwhile, dozens of stone-throwing demonstrators have defied police water cannons in Beirut a day after rare violence between both sides wounded nearly 400 people. The unprecedented protests have rocked the country since October last year. The rallies are demanding the removal of a political class they see as inept, corrupt, and responsible for an ever-deepening economic crisis. Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri stepped down last year, opening the way for political parties to form a new government. Political factions agreed in December to appoint ex-Education Minister Hassan Diab as the new premier. Parties have since squabbled over who should fill cabinet posts. Hariri is currently serving as a caretaker prime minister. In Jordan, Parliament has passed a draft law to ban the import of Israeli gas only days after it began a multi-billion-dollar deal struck in 2016. The motion was unanimously passed by 130 legislators and will be referred to the cabinet to become law. The $10 billion supply deal was struck between Jordan's state-owned utility and a U.S.-Israeli consortium. It was not referred to Parliament for approval. Although Jordan has a peace treaty with Israel, the deal has faced opposition from within government ranks. Canada is pushing Iran to hand over black box recorders from a Ukrainian passenger plane shot down in Tehran 2 weeks ago. Foreign Minister François-Philippe Champagne says the recorders should be passed on to France or Ukraine to be analyzed. The Canadian Foreign Minister spoke with his Iranian counterpart Javad Zarif. He said Ottawa wants Tehran to send the black boxes as soon as possible so the analysis can be done in a transparent fashion. Earlier, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau urged Iran to send the data recorders to France. He said the country is one of few which could decode the plane's data. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and French President Emmanuel Macron have restated their commitment to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. This comes after Johnson had called for the deal to be scrapped and replaced with a new one. The leaders of both countries agreed to a long-term framework during their meeting on the sidelines of the Libya summit in Berlin. A Downing Street spokesperson said they agreed on the importance of de-escalation and finding a diplomatic way through the current tensions. The leader's statement follows the deal's European signatories' triggering of a diplomatic dispute mechanism last week. Iran Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has described Europe's signatories as no longer trustworthy. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says the country stands for peace and stability in the region. After his visits to the U.S., Iran, Saudi Arabia and Oman, Qureshi tweeted he held constructive meetings with his respective counterparts as part of Pakistan's efforts to defuse tensions in the Middle East. In his meeting with the UN Secretary General in New York, the foreign minister said he stressed on the need to resolve the Kashmir issue as per Kashmiris' will. 70,000 people have come out onto the streets against a controversial Citizenship Act in India's eastern state of Jharkhand. Organizers say protesters included 30,000 women in Jharkhand's capital Ranchi. Speaking to media, the organizers said this was the biggest protest of the state against the new act. Protesters said the government will have to withdraw the act because it is against one religion and humanity. Meanwhile, hundreds held a rally from Jama Masjid to Shaheen Bagh in India's capital, New Delhi. Protesters paraded a mock detention camp during the march while chanting slogans of independence. Sumitra Khan, a leading member of India's ruling party, has called people and celebrities opposed to the controversial Citizenship Act dogs. Indian activists, students, politicians, and even actors have been protesting across the country against the anti-Muslim law for over a month. In a rally, the Bharatiya Janata Party leader said people who oppose the law are dogs of West Bengal's Chief Minister, Mamata Banerjee. Another BJP leader, Keshav Prasad Maurya, has called protesters opposing the act mentally affected. The ruling party leader said such people need medical treatment. 27 people have died in nationwide protests since the act was passed in December. Time now for a short break. I'll be back, though, after that with plenty more news. Stay tuned. Let's begin this segment in Russia, where protests against President Vladimir Putin's proposed constitutional reforms have failed to gain traction, with only a few hundred protesters on the streets. Rally organizers had urged people to speak out against Putin's proposed political changes. Many demonstrators instead chose to shout dissent on other issues. Diverse groups with different political demands, including anti-fascists, women's rights campaigners, and students, diluted the anti-Putin message. On January 15th, the Russian government resigned after Putin announced plans to change the constitution. Over 1,000 banks, asset managers, payment companies, and insurers in the European Union have planned to open offices in post-Brexit Britain. UK clients regulatory consultancy Boval says the financial firms intend to continue serving clients in Britain. Boval said the new offices and staff will help mitigate business losses as the current two-way direct access between Britain and the EU ends in December. As a first step, the organizations have applied for temporary permission to operate in the country. Boval said firms who until now have been able to serve UK customers come from France, Cyprus, and Germany. The extent of access to each other's markets after December is subject to negotiations between the EU and Britain. 3 men have been stabbed to death in Ilford, East London. Police say all 3 victims were pronounced dead on the scene. Authorities say no arrests have yet been made while they are still formally identifying the victims. They say the case could be a triple murder investigation. London Mayor Sadiq Khan condemned the killings, expressing his grief for the families and local community. Local media says UK knife crime has risen by 80% over the last 5 years. That includes 40,000 cases in the last 12 months. Chinese authorities have reported a third death from the outbreak of a mysterious new coronavirus. Health officials at the inland city of Wuhan say 9 others are in critical condition.
They say there have been a total of 139 new cases of the illness since December. Medics say the disease has spread to the capital Beijing and the southeastern city of Shenzhen. After WHO warnings, airport authorities in the US are screening passengers from Wuhan. Similar measures are also being taken in other countries, including Japan, Thailand, and South Korea. 5 cases have been reported in Singapore, 2 in Thailand, and 1 in Japan. South Korea has also confirmed its first case with a Chinese visitor.
7 people have died on the Indonesian island of Sumatra when a footbridge packed with people snapped. Police say some of the victims fell into the overflowing river below and drowned, while 3 more are still missing and are feared dead. Rescue officials say 30 people, mostly students, had just returned from a tour and stopped on the bridge to take photos. Officials said 20 survivors have been rescued, many with minor injuries. They said the river level below the bridge was higher than usual after torrential rains pounded the region. 200 people trapped under tons of snow because of an avalanche in Nepal's Annapurna region have been rescued. Officials say the rescued people, who included tourists, guides, and helpers, have now been taken to safety. Authorities say 7 missing trekkers have still not been found because of the harsh weather. Police say the trekkers include 4 South Koreans and 3 local guides. A tourism official says heavy layers of snow have covered the region, hindering the search and rescue operation. 3 people have been killed after a fire has erupted in a pipeline owned by Nigeria's state oil company in the commercial capital, Lagos. Residents say the fire also burned nearby houses and vehicles. Many fires on pipelines in Nigeria have been caused by theft and sabotage. The Director General of State Emergency Management Agency has said his team found that some undesirable elements vandalized the pipeline. Officials said the state oil company is assessing the situation. In the U.S., 2 police officers have been shot dead in Honolulu, near the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Authorities say the incident happened in a residential district near Diamond Head, a popular tourist destination. The man who fatally shot the officers then barricaded himself inside a house after setting it on fire. Officials believe he has now died. Police said they closed the street in Diamond Head near Waikiki Beach and are investigating. A recent study has found 1% of the world's richest population holds twice as much wealth as the bottom 90%. In a report, the global charity Oxfam says the gap between rich and the rest of humanity has reached grotesque proportions. The new report, Time to Care, shows the world's top 20 richest men now have more wealth than all women in Africa. The report says there are only 2,153 billionaires in the world, but their wealth matches that of 4.5 billion people. The report said India's richest 1% hold more than 4 times the wealth of the bottom 70% of that country's people. Stock markets in Asia are trading mixed after the People's Bank of China kept its loan prime rate steady. Investors are optimistic as these stocks record fresh rally. Seoul's Kospi has gained nearly 1% as Samsung shares jumped about 2% after the firm announced leadership changes. Hong Kong's Hang Seng is trading over 0.5% higher, even after shares of life insurer AIA dropped over 1%. The Shanghai Composite is trading over 0.5% higher after a surge in pharmaceutical stocks amid spreading new coronavirus. Jiangsu Siuhan Bioengineering and Shandong Lukang pharmaceutical stocks surged about 10%. The Nikkei 225 is trading fractionally higher, despite shares of index heavyweight fast retailing plunging over 1%. Storms have brought heavy rain to the fire-hit regions of eastern Australia, but authorities say the bushfire crisis is still far from over. More severe storms have also been forecast for the fire-ravaged states in the next few days. More than 80 blazes still burn across New South Wales and Victoria states, despite the downpours. Melbourne and Canberra have been hit by heavy hailstorms, with hail as big as golf balls witnessed in some areas. In the meantime, a huge dust storm has swept across towns in the central west of New South Wales. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. And with that, you're all caught up. Thank you for watching this bulletin here on Indus News.